Morning, my father handed my brother a check for $50,000. He looked at me across the breakfast table and said, "We got you something too, sweetheart," and slid over a gift card to Target for $250. I was 28. I had just passed my CPA exam on the first try. My brother had just quit his third job in 4 years. I remember the way the gift card felt in my hand, slightly warm from being in his wallet. The little Target bullseye logo in the corner, cheerful in red and completely humiliating. "Thanks, Dad," I said, and I meant it. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because by then I had learned that gratitude was the only language that kept the peace, and peace was the only thing that bought me time. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I was not a saint. I was not quietly noble. I was someone who had been watching this family operate like a closed system for decades, and I had finally decided to stop being a variable that everyone else got to control. My brother was 31. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming when they have never once been told no. A kind of loose, easy confidence that looks like warmth until you need something real from it. My father adored him, always had. My brother was his do-over, the version of himself he wished he'd been. Bold, spontaneous, unconcerned with consequences. My father called it living. I called it the rest of us cleaning up after him. My stepmother was different. She wasn't cruel exactly. She was careful. She had married my father when I was 12, and she'd always treated me with a kind of polite distance, like a house guest who had overstayed her welcome, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it. She loved my brother because my father loved my brother, and that was the whole of her loyalty. She pointed herself in whatever direction he faced. I had lived in their orbit for so long that I had stopped noticing how much space they took up. I paid my own way through college. Loans, 2 jobs, a scholarship I applied for 6 times before I got it. My father co-signed exactly one thing for me, a used Honda Civic when I was 22. And he reminded me of it at Thanksgiving for 3 consecutive years. He co-signed my brother's first apartment, his second apartment, a boat he sold 8 months later at a 40% loss, and a food truck concept that never made it off the napkin stage. None of that was mentioned at any Thanksgiving I can remember. I built a career in accounting, slow and glamorous work that requires you to be right, not impressive, not loud, just right. I was good at it. I became good at it the way you become good at anything when you grow up understanding that no one is going to come find you, so you'd better be somewhere worth finding. By 28, I was a senior associate at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte. I had a 1-bedroom apartment I loved, a savings account I never talked about, and a plan I had been quietly executing for about 2 years. Here's the thing about growing up underestimated: you learn to work in the margins. Nobody watches you, so you can move. The $50,000 check to my brother was for a real estate investment. That was what my father called it at the breakfast table, with the same proud proprietary tone he used when my brother did anything at all. My brother had met someone at a gym who had a contact who knew a developer. There was a property in Raleigh. There was a timeline. There was a lot of language designed to sound like a plan. I asked one question: what's the projected return and what's the exit strategy? My father looked at me like I had said something rude. My brother laughed. "Always the accountant," he said. Not unkindly. Just the way you'd say always the buzzkill. My stepmother smiled at her coffee cup. I dropped it. I finished my eggs. I drove home and I did not think about the money. Because the money was not the point. The point was the look on my father's face. That combination of pride and relief. Like my brother had finally become the thing my father needed him to be. And I was just evidence that some investments don't pay off. 6 months later, the real estate deal collapsed. The developer had outstanding liens my brother never verified. The contact from the gym was not a licensed agent. My father lost $38,000 of the $50,000. My brother lost exactly $0 because my brother had already quietly extracted his own cut as a finder's fee. My father never told me this. I found out the same way I found out most things about this family, by accident, by being quiet in rooms where people forgot I was listening. They fought about it once, loudly, on a Sunday afternoon when they thought I was in the backyard. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen, still in my jacket, keys in my hand, just arrived and completely forgotten. He took money from you, my stepmother said. Her voice was low and flat. He made a mistake, my father said. He's learning. He took money from you and called it a fee. He'll pay it back. She didn't say anything after that, neither did he. I went back outside and came in again, louder this time, announcing myself with the screen door, and by the time I walked into the kitchen, they were talking about the weather. My brother paid back nothing. My father lent him 11,000 more 8 months later, for a fresh start. I was informed of this during a phone call about Thanksgiving logistics. It was presented as incidental information, the way you'd mentioned that the sweet potatoes were going to be a different recipe this year. I said, "Okay, Dad." "You're not going to say anything?" he asked. There was something in his voice, not defensiveness exactly, more like disappointment that I wasn't going to fight him so he could explain himself. "What would you like me to say?" I asked. He didn't answer. I said I'd bring the pie and hung up. Here is what I did not say. That 3 years earlier, when I was 25 and just starting out, I'd asked my father for a loan of $8,000 to cover a gap between jobs. I had documentation. I had a repayment plan. I had a timeline. I had everything except a co-signer for the small personal loan I was trying to get, and the bank wanted 6 months of employment history I didn't yet have. He said no. He said he didn't want money to complicate the relationship. He said it with such genuine concern for my well-being that I almost thanked him. I covered the gap myself. It took 14 months, and I ate a lot of rice and worked a second job on weekends, and I did it, and I did not ask again. I tell you this, not so you'll feel sorry for me. I tell you this because that $8,000 no is the reason I kept such clean records. Every transfer, every conversation where money came up, every instance where he helped my brother and declined to help me, I kept notes. Not obsessively, not with any plan at first. Just the way you keep receipts when you've learned that nobody in your life is going to remember things accurately. The opportunity I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it came in the form of a client. I had been brought in to do a forensic accounting review for a small private equity group. A messy situation involving a minority partner dispute. The work was tedious and precise, and I was very good at it. The managing partner, a woman in her early 50s, named Claudia, watched me present findings to a room full of irritated men, and she said almost nothing. 2 weeks later, she called me directly, not through the firm, and asked if I was interested in a different kind of opportunity. The firm she was forming was small. 4 partners, specialized in acquisition accounting and due diligence for mid-market transactions. She wanted a 5th partner with exactly my profile. Detail-oriented, unshowy, unafraid of complicated situations. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in buying in. The buy-in was $40,000 and a 12-month non-compete from my current firm. I had $53,000 in savings. I had been building it in silence for 4 years. I said I needed 2 weeks to think. I took 10 days. I said yes. I gave notice at my firm on a Tuesday. I did not tell my family. I moved to a new apartment in a different neighborhood. I did not tell my family that either. I was not hiding. I was simply no longer narrating my life for an audience that had never really been paying attention. The firm grew faster than any of us expected. Claudia was exceptional at relationships. I was exceptional at the work that made the relationships worth having. Within 18 months, we had closed 11 transactions, and I had earned back my buy-in twice over. Within 3 years, my equity stake was worth considerably more than I had ever expected to have at 31. I did not post about it. I did not celebrate loudly. I bought better coffee and a sofa I actually liked, and I took myself to the coast for a long weekend and sat on a porch and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a person who had made it to the other side of something. My father found out the way people always find out things they weren't watching for, through someone else's carelessness. His old college friend's daughter worked at a company we had done due diligence for. She mentioned my name. He put it together. He called me on a Wednesday evening. I was eating dinner at my kitchen table, work spread around me, half a glass of wine. I heard you started a business, he said. A firm, I said. I'm a partner. Silence. Then, why didn't you tell us? I thought about that question for a moment. Why didn't you tell us? As though the information belonged to them. As though my silence was a thing done to them rather than a thing done for me. It didn't come up, I said. He asked about the firm. I gave him the broad strokes. He asked if it was doing well. I said yes. He asked how well. I said well enough. We should have dinner, he said. Catch up. Sure, I said. I'll be in town next month. I want to be clear about what I understood in that moment. The dinner was not about catching up. The dinner was the opening move of a new chapter. And I already knew the shape of it because I had watched this pattern my entire life. My brother had burned through the 50,000, the 11,000, the goodwill and the patience, and now my father needed a new source of optimism, and I had just revealed myself as a candidate. I was not angry. I want you to know that. I had done most of my grieving years earlier, in the quiet of apartments where I'd worked through the night and learned to want things for myself, without needing permission. What I felt was something cooler and more precise. I was interested to see exactly how it would unfold, because understanding the mechanism was the first step to making sure I was not caught in it. The dinner was at a steakhouse my father liked, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices and everyone pretends not to notice. My brother was there. My stepmother was there. My brother's girlfriend, a pleasant woman named Haley who I had met twice and who deserved better, was also there. My brother ordered a $40 appetizer without looking at anyone. My father ordered a bottle of wine I knew cost $200 at that restaurant. My stepmother smiled at me in that careful way she had, the one that always made me feel like she was deciding how much warmth to allocate. Halfway through the main course, my father leaned back in his chair and said, "We've been thinking about a family investment." I put down my fork. Not dramatically, just set it down. "My brother has an opportunity," my father said. He looked at my brother. My brother launched into it. A friend of a friend, a development project, commercial real estate in a secondary market, projected returns. I listened to the whole thing. I asked no questions. When my brother finished, my father looked at me with this expression I recognized. It was the same expression he used when he was about to ask my stepmother to do something he knew she would have to agree to in front of everyone. "We thought if you had capacity," he said, "it might be nice. Family working together." "How much?" I asked. "Whatever you're comfortable with," my father said. We were thinking, the three of us together, maybe 75,000 total. "What would the three of us be contributing?" I asked. My brother and my father exchanged a look. "We'd be putting in, between us, 25, my father said. "We were hoping you could cover the rest." There it was. $50,000. From me. For a family investment involving the same person who had already cost my father $38,000, extracted a finder's fee, and paid back nothing. To be presented as a partnership. To be framed as an opportunity. I looked at my brother. He was looking at his plate. I said, "I'm going to need to see the documentation." My brother's head came up. "Sure, yeah, of course." "Full documentation," I said. "The development agreement, the principles, the title history, proof of licensure, existing encumbrances, projected timeline with benchmarks, and a legal review of the investment structure. I'll have my attorney look at it and I'll have an answer in 2 weeks." My father looked like I had asked him to take a blood oath. "It's family," he said. "I know," I said. "That's why I want to make sure it's solid. If it's a good deal, the documentation will show that." Nobody said anything. My brother cleared his throat. Haley looked at the breadbasket. My stepmother stared at a point slightly above my head. The documentation never arrived. I waited the 2 weeks. I followed up once by email. Nothing came. I was not surprised. What did come 10 days after the dinner was a phone call from my stepmother. This was unusual. She and I did not have phone calls. We had hallway conversations at holidays and polite exchanges at the dinner table. but she had never called me directly in my adult life. She started with small talk, which lasted approximately 90 seconds before she arrived at her actual point. My father, she said, was under a lot of financial stress. There was an equity line on the house they'd taken out several years ago. There were some credit card balances. My brother's situation had cost them more than I knew, and she wanted me to understand that this was a real hardship, not a lecture. I listened. I said I was sorry to hear it. I meant that. He would never ask you directly, she said, but I think he needs help. What kind of help? I asked. She said a number. It was not 50,000. It was larger. I asked what the help would be used for. She gave a broad description: debts, stability, breathing room. I asked whether the equity line on the house was current. She paused for a moment and said yes. That pause told me something. I had been doing forensic accounting for 4 years. I knew what pauses meant. I'll look into some options, I said. Can you send me a clear picture of what you owe and to whom? She said she would. She did not. What I did instead was what I should have done years earlier. I pulled the public records, property records, court filings, the equity line documentation, and everything available through the county clerk's office. It took me 2 hours. What I found was not a family in crisis. What I found was a family that had made a series of leveraged decisions over many years, the most recent of which was a significant transfer wire record, public in the context of a small claims dispute that had been filed and then settled, to my brother, 18 months ago, $60,000, framed in the filing as a personal loan. My father had given my brother $60,000 18 months before asking me for help. I sat with that for a while. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table in the same apartment where I had built this life in careful, unglamorous increments, and I thought about the $8,000 they had refused me when I was 25 and eating rice and working weekends. I was not going to give them the money. That had been true before I pulled the records. But what I understood now was that this was not a family that had fallen on hard times. This was a pattern. This was a structure. And I had been, for my entire life, the member of this family designated to absorb the consequences of everyone else's decisions without being included in them. I called my father the next morning. I said, I looked at the public records. I know about the 60,000. Silence. I'm not going to help with the debt, I said, but I want you to know, and I want you to hear this clearly, that I'm not angry. I understand exactly what happened, and I understand exactly what this family has been. And I'm choosing, right now, to step out of it. What does that mean? He asked. It means I love you, I said. It means I wish you well. It means I'm not available to be a resource for decisions I wasn't included in making. He said my name. Then he said I was being dramatic. Then he said I had no idea how hard things had been. I know how hard things have been, I said. I built my whole career on nobody watching what I was doing. I know exactly how hard it is. He didn't have an answer for that. My brother called that evening. His tone was different from my father's. Less wounded, more irritated. The way people get when they realize a system they relied on is no longer functioning. He told me I was tearing the family apart. He said I had always had a chip on my shoulder. He said that money was changing me. The money didn't change me, I said. It just made it easier for you to see what was already there. He hung up. I finished the rest of my tea. My stepmother sent a text 3 days later. It said, I hope you know we love you. I believed her. I also understood that love, in this family, had always been a thing offered in exchange for compliance, and I was no longer available to make that trade. I blocked none of them. I didn't go silent, or dramatic, or vengeful. I had spent enough of my life performing emotions for an audience that wasn't watching. What I did was simpler and, I think, truer. I redirected. I stopped waiting for their approval. I stopped translating my life into terms they could value. I stopped hoping that one day they would look at me the way they looked at my brother and feel the same uncomplicated pride. I started, instead, looking at myself that way. I called my maternal grandmother that weekend. She lived 3 hours away, and we talked every few weeks. Long calls about nothing and everything. The way you talk when someone actually wants to know how you are. I told her the broad version. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. Did you feel free? She asked when I was done. I thought about it honestly. Not yet, I said, but closer. That's how it works, she said. Freedom isn't a feeling you get all at once, it's a habit. I wrote that down. I still have it. A year later, my father called again. It was a Sunday late afternoon. He asked how I was doing. I told him. He asked about the firm. I told him. He didn't ask for anything, which was either progress or a more sophisticated approach. I was prepared for both. At the end of the call, he said, I know I wasn't always fair. I said, I know. Is that all you're going to say? He asked. I thought about everything I could have said, the Target gift card, the $8,000, the look across the breakfast table that morning with the check, and the coffee and the cheerful red bullseye. I thought about rice for 14 months and weekend shifts and a scholarship application I sent 6 times before anyone said yes. It's enough, I said. It's what I've got right now. He accepted that. I don't know if he understood it, probably not. But I had stopped needing him to understand in order to move forward, and that, more than anything I had earned or built or proven, was the thing I was most proud of. There's a version of this story where I cut everyone off and never looked back, and I think that version gets told a lot because it's clean and it's satisfying. The villain gets their consequence, and the hero walks into the sunset with the music swelling. My version is messier. I still talk to my father. We are careful with each other, the way you're careful around something that has healed imperfectly. I don't go to every holiday, but I go to some of them. My brother and I exist in a détente that I would describe as civil, which is more than I expected and probably more than he deserves. What changed was not them. What changed was the accounting. I stopped putting in more than I was getting. I stopped waiting for the balance to come right on its own. I stopped accepting the terms of a ledger I hadn't agreed to. And when I finally did the actual math, not emotionally but practically, the way I do every other thing in my life, the answer was so obvious and so long overdue that I almost laughed. I had been a profitable investment for this family for 30 years. I had paid dividends in patience and silence and accommodation, and I had never once collected. I collected. Not in a way they would describe that way. Not in a courtroom or a confrontation or a dramatic dinner where I laid out evidence and watched them crumble. Just in my own ledger, in my own life, in the quiet of an apartment I chose, and a career I built, and a morning routine where I drink the good coffee and sit with my grandmother's words written on a piece of paper I take to my fridge 3 years ago. Freedom isn't a feeling you get all at once. It's a habit. I was small for a long time in that family. I was the safe bet they never made, the asset they never valued, the line item they consistently underestimated. I worked in the margins because that was the only space I had. It turned out the margins were enough. There's something nobody tells you about being the overlooked one in a family. It becomes, if you let it, the most useful thing that ever happened to you. I didn't understand that for a long time. For years I thought the $250 gift card was just about money. The denied loan was just about money. The $50,000 to my brother, the $60,000 after that, the steakhouse dinner where they asked me to cover the rest. I kept trying to do the math on each individual moment like they were separate transactions. They weren't. They were one transaction, repeated across decades, and the terms were simple. I give, they take, and we all pretend the ledger is balanced because we call it family. What changed me wasn't the success. I want to be honest about that. Claudia giving me a shot, the firm growing, the equity stake becoming something real. None of that changed the way I thought about myself. What changed me was earlier, quieter, harder. It was the years of rice and weekend shifts and scholarship applications sent 6 times into silence. It was learning to want things without needing anyone to validate the wanting. That's not a story people tell because it doesn't have a clean villain or a dramatic turning point. It's just a woman, alone in an apartment, deciding over and over again to keep going. But here's what I've come to understand about how things unfold. Character compounds. The same way interest accumulates on a savings account, Every choice you make about who you are builds on the last one. Every time I chose precision over shortcuts, integrity over the easier version of events, honesty with myself about what I was actually dealing with. Those choices stacked up. They became the foundation. When the moment came to make a real decision, I didn't have to figure out who I was, because I had been quietly becoming her for years. And the opposite is also true. My brother's choices compounded too. Every time he extracted a fee he hadn't earned, every loan he didn't repay, every opportunity that cost someone else more than it cost him, those stacked up as well. Not as punishment from some outside force, just as consequence. The mechanism is simple and it doesn't require any drama. Who you are consistently becomes what you have, eventually. The hardest part wasn't walking away from the money they wanted. It was letting go of the version of the story where they'll finally saw me clearly and felt the full weight of what they'd done. I wanted that. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. There's a part of every person who grew up invisible that still wants the room to go quiet and turn around and notice them. But I didn't get that moment, and I think now I'm glad I didn't, because what I got instead was better. I stopped needing it. My grandmother set freedom as a habit. I think she's right. And I think the habit starts with one small act of intellectual honesty. Looking at your situation without flinching. Without the softening that comes from wanting people to be different than they are. That kind of clear-eyed thinking is not cold. It is, I've learned, the most caring thing you can do for yourself. It's the beginning of building something real. The margins were where I started. They turned out to be enough room for everything.